Every Sunday at exactly 8 in the evening, my son called to ask the exact same question. Dad, are you alone? For 2 years, I thought it was love. I thought it was a son worrying about his aging, widowed father living by himself in a big, empty house. I always told him the truth. I always said, yes, I am alone. But last Sunday, something felt fundamentally wrong. The air in the house was too heavy. So for the first time in my life, I lied to my only child. And that single lie is the only reason I am still alive to tell you this story today. Before I show you the exact moment a father realizes his own flesh and blood is hunting him, tell me where you are listening from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe. If you believe that sometimes the most dangerous people in our lives are the ones who share our last name. I am Russell. I am 63 years old, and I spent my entire career as a structural engineer. My job was to look at complex blueprints and find the catastrophic weak points before the concrete was even poured. I know how things collapse. I know the exact amount of pressure it takes to bring a towering building down to its foundation. But I never saw the hairline fractures in my own family. It was Sunday night, 8 o'clock. The neighborhood was dead quiet. The kind of quiet that makes the ticking of the kitchen clock sound like a hammer hitting an anvil. I was sitting in my leather armchair, sipping decaf, staring at the grid of security camera feeds glowing on the tablet resting on my coffee table. I installed those cameras myself after my wife Barbara passed away. High-definition night vision motion activated. Not because I was paranoid, but because an engineer likes to know the exact status of his perimeter at all times. At 7:58, screen number 4 flickered. The front porch camera. The motion detector did not trigger the overhead floodlight, which meant someone had deliberately unscrewed the bulb or disabled the infrared sensor. My heart did a strange, slow flutter against my ribs. I picked up the tablet and zoomed in. A man was standing on my front porch. He was perfectly still, pressed flat against the brick wall right beside my heavy oak front door. He wore a dark hooded jacket, his face completely swallowed by shadows. He was not ringing the bell. He was not knocking. He was just waiting. He had the coiled posture of a predator, anticipating a signal. His right hand was tucked deep into his coat pocket, weighing down the fabric. He was holding something heavy and metallic. I could see the rigid outline pressing against the nylon. The digital clock on the stove ticked over to exactly 8 o'clock. Right on cue, the house phone rang. It was jarring, slicing through the total silence of the living room. I looked at the caller ID on the handset. Justin, my son, my blood. The boy I taught to ride a bicycle in the very driveway this stranger was now standing in. I picked up the receiver, my eyes never leaving the shadowy figure on the glowing tablet screen. "Hey, Dad," Justin said. His voice was smooth, casual, maybe a little too bright. "How is your Sunday going?" I kept my breathing steady and my voice perfectly level. "It is quiet, Justin. Just reading my book." Then came the question. The exact same question he asked every single week like absolute clockwork. "So are you alone tonight?" The words hit me completely differently this time. My engineering brain immediately started connecting the data points, drawing the invisible lines between the armed man lurking in the shadows of my porch and the casual, chilling inquiry of my son on the phone. Justin was not checking in. He was checking the perimeter. He was the scout, confirming that the target was isolated and vulnerable. A cold, numbing sensation washed over my entire body, starting from the base of my neck and settling deep into my stomach. It was the terrifying realization that the son I raised and provided for was actively orchestrating my destruction. I gripped the phone tighter, feeling the plastic creak under my fingers. "No, Justin," I lied smoothly, pushing down the panic rising in my throat. "Actually, I am not alone tonight. Officer Barnes from the local precinct stopped by. He is sitting right here across from me having a cup of coffee. We are just catching up on some recent neighborhood watch business." The silence on the other end of the line, was absolute. It lasted exactly 3 seconds, but it felt like 3 agonizing hours. I could hear the faint sound of Justin swallowing hard. Then, on my tablet screen, the figure on the porch violently flinched. The man pulled a burner phone out of his left pocket, looked at the glowing screen for a fraction of a second, and visibly panicked. He abandoned his position against the wall. He turned and sprinted off my porch, clearing the steps in a single leap and tearing across the front lawn. He did not care about being stealthy anymore. He ran straight toward a black sedan idling silently down the street, with its headlights completely off. The heavy car door slammed shut, and the tires screeched loudly against the cold asphalt as the vehicle sped away into the dark. "Oh!" Justin finally stammered on the phone, his voice suddenly tight and high-pitched, stripped of all its previous warmth. "That is good. Tell Officer Barnes I said hello. I have to go, Dad. Big meeting at work early tomorrow." He hung up the phone before I could even say goodbye. I slowly placed the receiver back on the base station. The house returned to its suffocating silence. I did not panic. I did not dial 911. Calling the police would mean handing over control of the situation to strangers. It would mean giving Justin a chance to lie his way out of it, to claim it was a coincidence or a misunderstanding. I needed absolute, undeniable proof before I tore my own world apart and held my son accountable. I stood up from my chair and walked over to the front door. I did not turn on the hallway lights. I leaned in and looked through the brass peephole. The street was completely empty. The immediate physical threat was gone for tonight, but the war had just officially begun. My son thought he was dealing with a tired, oblivious old man waiting out his final years in a soft recliner. He thought I was an easy mark, a fading asset ready to be liquidated for his own convenience. He forgot who raised him. He forgot that I spent 40 years calculating structural integrity, anticipating disasters, and reinforcing weak points against catastrophic failure. I walked back to my tablet and saved the video file of the fleeing intruder. If Justin wanted to tear my life down to steal whatever he thought I was hiding, he was going to find out the hard way that this house and this old man were built on solid steel. He wanted to test my foundations. Now I was going to test his. I stood in the dark hallway for a long time, just staring at the heavy oak front door. My heart was no longer hammering in my chest like a frightened animal. The initial shock of seeing that shadowy figure on my monitor had completely burned away, leaving nothing but a cold, sharp clarity in my mind. I walked slowly over to the entryway. The wooden floorboards creaked under my weight, a familiar sound that usually brought me comfort, but now felt like an alarm. I reached out and ran my fingers over the cold brass surface of the deadbolt. I am a structural engineer by trade. I have spent my entire adult life analyzing physical evidence, testing materials, and looking for the exact point where a system fails. I bent down and shined a small penlight directly onto the keyhole. I looked closely at the metal plate surrounding the mechanism. There were no fresh scratches on the brass. The internal pins were perfectly aligned. The heavy doorframe was completely intact without a single splinter of wood out of place. The intruder had not tried to force his way in. He had not used a crowbar or a lock-picking kit. He had unlocked my front door smoothly and quietly. He had a key. I closed my eyes and let that terrifying reality sink deep into my bones. There were only 2 physical keys to this house in existence. I had one sitting in the ceramic bowl on my kitchen counter. The other was on a silver keychain in my son Justin's pocket. I had given it to him 5 years ago, telling him it was for absolute emergencies only. He had taken that symbol of ultimate trust, that literal key to his father's safety, and he had handed it to a stranger in the dead of night. Every instinct of a normal father would be to pick up the phone and demand answers. A normal father would scream into the receiver. A normal father would threaten to call the police and demand to know why a strange man was standing on his porch with a weapon. But I did not reach for the phone. I knew exactly how Justin operated. If I confronted him right now, he would act completely shocked. He would play the role of the concerned son perfectly. He would tell me I was imagining things or seeing shadows. He would gaslight me and gently suggest that my mind was slipping in my old age. He might even use my accusation as legal proof that I could no longer live on my own and needed to be put in a home. Most importantly, if I let him know that I was aware of his plan, he would simply change his tactics. He would strike faster and harder before I could prepare my defenses. I was not going to give him that advantage. When you discover a fundamental hidden flaw in a concrete foundation, you do not yell at the concrete. You quietly reinforce the load-bearing walls. You prepare for the inevitable collapse entirely on your own terms. I decided right then and there in the quiet dark of my hallway that I would not say a single word to my son. Justin assumed he was hunting a tired old man living on a modest fixed pension. He thought this aging house was the only asset of real value left to steal. He was profoundly wrong. 10 years ago, my beautiful wife Barbara passed away after a very short, very aggressive illness. It broke my heart and emptied my soul, but it did not break my finances. Barbara was a brilliant woman who had insisted on carrying a massive, comprehensive life insurance policy for decades. When she died, the financial payout was completely tax-free and absolutely staggering. It was more money than Justin could ever possibly imagine. But even back then, sitting in the hospital room, I saw the deep cracks in my son's character. I saw his dangerous, unchecked appetite for expensive leased cars, luxury vacations, and high-end real estate that he could not actually afford to maintain. I knew with absolute certainty that if I handed him a massive fortune, he would burn through it in a matter of years and destroy his own life and his marriage in the process. So I made a very quiet and very permanent decision to protect him from his own greed. I took the entire insurance payout and quietly converted it into physical, untraceable bearer bonds. I brought those bonds back to this house, and I sealed them inside a custom-built heavy steel floor safe that I personally engineered and installed beneath the thick concrete foundation of my basement workshop. To the outside world, and especially to my son, I was just a retired widower counting his pennies. I drove a 10-year-old truck. I bought my clothes on sale at the local department store. I lived a very quiet, very humble life. The financial illusion was absolutely perfect. And now that carefully crafted illusion was the only thing standing between my life savings and my son's treacherous plans. The next morning, the sun came up over a house that was no longer a sanctuary. It was now a tactical environment. I skipped my usual morning walk and drove my truck to a specialized commercial electronics supplier 3 towns over to ensure I would not be recognized. I paid in cash for 6 microscopic high-definition motion-activated cameras. These were not the cheap, bulky consumer-grade cameras you stick on a front porch to watch for package thieves. These were highly sensitive industrial lenses designed to be embedded in tight, secure spaces for corporate espionage. Over the next 48 hours, I went to work with the methodical precision of a younger man. I waited until I knew Justin was safely sitting in his corporate office downtown. Then I carried a heavy aluminum ladder through my own home and systematically removed the painted metal grates from the heating and cooling vents in every major room. The smell of old dust and dry air filled my lungs as I used my specialized engineering tools to mount the tiny black lenses deep inside the aluminum ductwork. I angled them perfectly to capture a wide view of the entire room without being visible from the floor, even if someone shined a flashlight directly up into the vent. I ran the ultra-thin fiber optic wiring along the hidden interior seams of the drywall, feeding the lines directly down through the floorboards into a heavily encrypted local server that I concealed inside a false panel in the basement utility closet. It was meticulous, exhausting physical work for a man my age. My knees ached terribly, and the joints in my hands cramped from gripping the small tools, but I absolutely did not stop to rest until the entire surveillance grid was completely operational. I walked from room to room, testing every single angle and adjusting the motion sensitivity parameters. The living room, the main hallway, the master bedroom, and the narrow basement stairs were all under absolute invisible surveillance. Nothing human could move inside my house without triggering a silent high-speed alert directly to my secure private network. I finally sat down at my kitchen table, my hands covered in gray dust, and wiped the heavy sweat from my forehead. The trap was fully set. The perimeter was officially secured from the inside out. I poured myself a tall glass of cold ice water and looked at the glowing green dots on my encrypted control monitor. Justin truly thought he was the grand architect of my downfall. He thought he was playing a brilliant game against a weak opponent. But he was about to step blindly into a rigid, unyielding structure completely designed by a master engineer. He had crossed the line from son to intruder. The silent adjustment had officially begun, and I was ready for whatever he tried to do next. Wednesday arrived with a heavy, suffocating tension. For 3 days, I had lived like a ghost in my own home. I did not call my son. I did not leave the house. I sat in my reinforced master bedroom with the heavy deadbolt locked, watching the glowing green feeds on my encrypted tablet. Sleep was entirely impossible. Every creak of the settling house felt like an approaching footstep. But the real breach did not happen until 2 a.m. on Wednesday night. The silent alarm on my bedside monitor pulsed a bright warning red. My eyes snapped open. I reached for the tablet, my hands completely steady. I was not afraid anymore. I was ready. I tapped the screen and brought up the living room feed. The night vision camera cast a pale, ghostly light over the familiar furniture. The front door slowly swung open. Justin stepped inside. He did not turn on the lights. He moved with the practiced silence of someone who grew up memorizing the creaky floorboards of a house. But this time, he was not alone. A massive shadow stepped in right behind him. The stranger was a huge, imposing man wearing a heavy leather jacket. Even through the grainy night vision feed, I could see the cold, professional menace in the way he carried himself. In his right hand, he gripped a thick, solid iron crowbar. My breath caught in my throat. I watched the screen intensely, waiting to see what their target was. I assumed they would go for the easy items first. The expensive flat-screen television mounted on the wall. The antique silver flatware in the dining room cabinet. But they ignored all of it. They walked right past thousands of dollars worth of easily pawned electronics and headed straight toward the back hallway leading down to the basement. They were moving with a specific, highly calculated purpose. I switched the camera feed to the basement stairwell. The microscopic lens hidden inside the air conditioning vent gave me a perfect overhead view. Justin was leading the stranger directly toward my old engineering workshop. They stopped in the center of the concrete floor. The big man tucked the crowbar under his arm and reached into his jacket. He pulled out a piece of specialized hardware. It had a glowing digital screen and a thick sensor array. My engineering mind instantly recognized it. It was a high-grade thermal imaging scanner. They were not here to smash and grab. They were here for a surgical extraction. 30 years ago, when I built this house, I poured a custom reinforced concrete slab in the basement. Deep inside that slab, I engineered a heavy steel floor safe. Because steel absorbs and retains temperature at a completely different rate than standard porous concrete, a thermal scanner would easily detect the rectangular temperature anomaly hidden beneath the surface. Justin knew this. I had taught him about thermal dynamics in this exact basement when he was just a teenager helping me with science fair projects. He was now weaponizing the very education I paid for against me. I reached over and turned up the volume on the tablet. The highly sensitive microphones I had wired into the vents picked up their voices perfectly. The audio was crystal clear, cutting through the dark silence of my bedroom. The big man swept the thermal scanner across the floor and let out a low, frustrated grunt. He asked Justin if he was absolutely sure about the location. Justin wiped his forehead, his hands shaking visibly on the camera feed. He promised the man the vault was there. He said his crazy old man built it decades ago and never trusted banks. Then the stranger asked what would happen if the old man woke up and came downstairs. The response my son gave completely froze the blood in my veins. Justin let out a quiet, dismissive laugh. He told the man not to worry about it. He said I was completely losing my mind lately anyway. He whispered that my memory was so gone I probably would not even notice the money was missing for months. And if I did complain, no one would believe a senile old fool. The betrayal was absolute. It was not just the attempted theft of my life savings. It was the complete erasure of my dignity. My son had already written the narrative of my downfall. He was actively planning to use my advancing age as a weapon against me, painting me as a dementia patient to cover his own tracks. He was going to rob me blind, and then convince the world I had simply lost my mind. I kept watching the feed, analyzing the dynamic between the two men. The stranger with the crowbar was not a friend helping Justin out of a jam. He was a predator. He stepped closer to my son, using his massive size to back Justin against the concrete wall. He tapped the heavy iron bar against the palm of his hand and told Justin he had exactly 48 hours to crack the steel open and hand over the cash. The man said his boss was tired of waiting for the gambling debts to be settled. The puzzle pieces locked together in my mind with terrifying clarity. Justin was not just greedy. He was desperate. He had dug himself into a massive illicit hole with dangerous underground debt collectors. This man was a local enforcer sent to collect. Justin had literally sold out his own father to save his own kneecaps. He had brought a violent criminal into the home where his mother had lived and died just to pay off his own degenerate mistakes. Down in the basement, the thermal scanner finally beeped. The screen lit up, showing a perfect rectangular outline glowing beneath the concrete. The enforcer nodded in satisfaction. He told Justin he better have the right industrial drilling equipment ready by the weekend. Justin swallowed hard and nodded frantically, promising he would get the tools and come back when I was asleep. The enforcer turned and walked back up the stairs, leaving Justin alone in the dark for a moment. My son looked down at the floor, directly at the spot where the safe was buried. He did not look guilty. He looked relieved. I watched them walk out the front door and get back into the dark sedan parked down the street. The house fell completely silent once again. I sat in the dark holding the tablet. The pain in my chest was heavy, but it was no longer the pain of a broken heart. It was the cold, heavy pressure of absolute resolve. Justin had set the timeline. He was coming back this weekend with heavy tools to breach my vault. He thought the money was still sitting there waiting for him. He thought his senile old father was fast asleep upstairs, completely oblivious to the wolves circling the property. I stood up from the bed and walked over to my closet. I pulled out my heavy steel-toed work boots and laced them up in the dark. I did not have time to sit around feeling sorry for myself. The appraisal was complete, and the enemy had revealed their exact strategy. They wanted to crack the vault, but they had absolutely no idea that the man who built that vault was already 3 steps ahead of them. I was going to give them exactly what they were looking for, but it would be the very last thing they ever wanted to find. The real work had to begin tonight. The front door clicked shut on the video feed, and the dark sedan rolled away down the quiet suburban street. I waited exactly 30 minutes in the dark silence of my bedroom, just to be absolutely certain the perimeter was clear. The heavy adrenaline that had been pumping through my chest slowly faded away. It was replaced by a cold, mechanical precision. I was no longer a grieving widower or a disappointed father. I was an engineer confronting a critical structural threat. I stood up from my bed and walked quietly down the hallway toward the basement stairs. The air grew cooler as I descended into the dark. The faint smell of concrete and old motor oil filled my lungs. I walked past my old wooden workbenches and stopped in the exact center of the concrete floor. This was the precise spot where Justin and the violent enforcer had pointed their thermal scanner. I knelt down on the cold ground and grabbed the edge of the heavy black rubber mat that covered my work area. I pulled it back, revealing a completely seamless square of gray concrete. To the naked eye, it looked like a solid foundational slab, but it was actually a heavy tapered plug that I had poured myself over 3 decades ago. I reached over to my tool bench and grabbed a specialized industrial suction handle. I locked it onto the smooth concrete surface and pulled upward with all my strength. The heavy block lifted away with a soft grinding sound, exposing the thick, impenetrable steel dial of my custom-built floor safe. I rested on my knees for a moment, staring down at the cold metal. This vault was supposed to be the ultimate protection for my family. It was designed to survive fires, floods, and home invasions. It was never designed to protect me from my own son. I reached down and grasped the heavy brass dial. 3 turns to the left, stopping precisely on the first number. 2 turns to the right, passing the second number once before stopping. 1 final turn to the left until the internal tumblers aligned with a heavy, satisfying clack. I grabbed the recessed handle and pulled upward. The heavy steel door, which weighed over 80 pounds, groaned as it swung open on its thick, oiled hinges. Inside, resting in the absolute pitch-black cavity of the vault, were the bearer bonds, $600,000 in untraceable paper. The physical manifestation of my late wife and her endless dedication to our family. Looking at the neatly stacked bundles wrapped in heavy rubber bands, I felt a brief sickening wave of profound sadness. Justin was willing to destroy all of this history to cover his own illicit gambling debts. I reached down into the dark hole and pulled every single stack of paper out. I placed the bundles carefully into a worn green canvas duffel bag. The vault was now completely empty, but I could not leave it that way. An empty vault simply tells a thief that they arrived too late. It leaves them frustrated, but still hungry. A vault with a carefully placed message, however, tells them they were completely outsmarted. It shatters their ego and forces them to face their own utter incompetence. I stood up and walked over to my tall metal filing cabinet tucked into the far corner of the workshop. I unlocked the heavy bottom drawer and pulled out a thick, worn manila folder. The edges of the paper were frayed and yellowing with age. Inside were dozens of pages of legal documents, bank statements, and final collection notices from exactly 10 years ago. It was the complete documented history of my son's greatest hidden failure. When Justin was in his early 20s, he had gone to a very expensive private university. He took out massive student loans promising me he would pay every cent back the moment he landed his high-paying corporate job. But Justin liked the illusion of wealth far more than the reality of hard work. He bought expensive tailored clothes, he took lavish trips to beach resorts, and he leased cars he could not afford. He defaulted on every single student loan. He was on the verge of complete financial ruin. He was facing severe legal action that would have permanently destroyed his credit and ruined his professional career before it even started. But he was too proud to ask for help. He never told me a single thing about it. I only found out when a collection agency accidentally called my home phone looking for him. I did not scream at him. I did not humiliate him. I simply took the money from my own retirement savings and quietly paid off every single cent of his crushing debt. I saved him from total destruction, and I never asked him for a single thank you. I let him believe that a miraculous clerical error had wiped his slate clean so he could keep his inflated pride intact. Now that exact same pride was going to be the poison that ruined him. I took the thick stack of notarized payoff documents and placed them directly into the center of the cold, empty steel floor safe. Then I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small yellow sticky note and a thick black marker. I did not write a long emotional letter. I did not express my heartbreak or demand a tearful apology. I simply wrote 2 words in clear, bold, capital letters. I know. I placed the bright yellow square directly on top of the financial documents, right where the flashlight beam would hit it. I closed the heavy steel door. I spun the dial, aggressively scrambling the combination. I placed the heavy concrete plug back into the floor and kicked the rubber mat over it. The decoy was officially set, and the psychological trap was armed. I did not go back to sleep. By the time the sun came up on Thursday morning, I was already sitting in my truck, driving toward the financial district of the city. The green canvas duffel bag was sitting heavily on the passenger seat beside me. I pulled into the underground parking garage of a towering glass building and took the silent express elevator up to the 40th floor. The heavy brass letters on the frosted glass doors read, Gallagher and Associates. Mr. Gallagher was not a warm, friendly family lawyer who drafted simple wills. He was a ruthless, highly aggressive estate attorney who specialized in shielding high-net-worth individuals from predatory relatives and corporate hostile takeovers. I had quietly retained his services years ago as a mere precaution, but I never truly believed I would need him to protect me from my own flesh and blood. I sat down in his polished mahogany office and placed the heavy canvas bag directly onto his massive desk. I looked him in the eye and told him the time had come to execute the final contingency plan. Mr. Gallagher did not ask emotional questions. He did not offer useless sympathy. He simply nodded, his expression completely cold and professional. He slid a thick stack of prepared incorporation documents across the table. Within 45 minutes, we had completely transferred the $600,000 in bearer bonds into a newly formed anonymous limited liability company. The company was legally controlled entirely by Mr. Gallagher's firm, holding the massive assets in an impenetrable blind trust, strictly for my benefit. We walked together out of the office building and down the busy street to a private high-security banking facility. We went deep underground into the sterile steel-lined vault room. I watched as the bank manager and Mr. Gallagher turned their dual keys simultaneously. We placed the canvas bag into a massive steel safety deposit box registered solely to the new anonymous corporate entity. The heavy metal door slammed shut, locking my entire life savings away behind a wall of titanium and corporate law. I walked out of the bank and stood on the busy sidewalk with nothing in my hands but the keys to my old truck. My personal net worth on public paper was now practically zero. The target Justin and his violent friend were planning to attack no longer existed. They could come back this weekend. They could bring heavy industrial drills. They could burn through the steel floor safe with cutting torches. They could spend hours destroying my basement in a desperate sweat. But the prize was completely gone. All they were going to find at the bottom of that dark hole was a brutal, agonizing reminder of Justin's own pathetic failures. The counterstrike was flawless, and my son had no idea that he had already completely lost the war. Sunday arrived with a bright, cheerful sun that felt completely out of place against the dark, heavy reality of my life. I was sitting in my worn leather armchair, pretending to read the morning newspaper, when the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway broke the silence. I glanced up at the hidden security monitor resting on the bookshelf. A silver luxury sport utility vehicle had just parked near the front porch. The heavy doors swung open, and out stepped my son Justin and his wife Monica. They were both holding brown paper bags from an expensive Italian bakery downtown. They walked up the front steps, putting on wide, enthusiastic smiles for the neighborhood to see. The doorbell rang with a sharp, cheerful chime. I took a deep, slow breath, letting my shoulders slump just a little bit. I forced the sharp, calculating edge to leave my eyes. I walked slowly to the entryway, opened the door, and put on the perfect mask of a lonely, grateful father who was thrilled to see his family. Justin leaned in and hugged me. The embrace felt stiff and entirely unnatural. His body was tense like a coiled spring. He said they decided to drop by for a surprise Sunday lunch because they were just in the neighborhood and knew I loved those cream-filled cannolis. Monica leaned over and kissed my cheek. Her expensive floral perfume was overwhelming, trying to mask the sharp scent of nervous sweat. She immediately grabbed my arm with forced affection and steered me toward the kitchen, saying she wanted to make me a fresh pot of coffee and hear absolutely everything about my quiet week. She was talking fast, far too fast. Her eyes were darting rapidly around the room, looking for any signs of suspicion. As Monica pushed me gently into a wooden kitchen chair, Justin hovered awkwardly in the hallway. He cleared his throat loudly and said he needed to use the restroom, but he also wanted to check the breaker panel in the basement because he noticed the porch light was flickering when they drove up. It was a flimsy, pathetic excuse. A month ago, I would have believed him blindly and thanked him for being such a helpful, attentive son. Today I just smiled warmly, poured on the innocent charm, and told him to take his time down there. I watched him walk toward the basement door. He was carrying a large, heavy canvas gym bag slung over his shoulder. A heavy gym bag that clinked softly with the unmistakable sound of dense, heavy metal tools striking against each other. Monica immediately stepped directly into my line of sight, completely blocking my view of the hallway. She started unpacking the pastries with aggressive, frantic enthusiasm. She asked me about the weather. She asked me if my tomato plants were growing well this season. She asked me if I had been watching any good television shows lately. She was desperately filling the air with meaningless noise, trying to build a solid wall of sound between me and the basement stairs. I played the role perfectly. I gave her slow, rambling answers about gardening soil and old black and white Western movies. I acted like a fragile, lonely man, completely charmed by his lovely, caring daughter-in-law. But my mind was not in the kitchen. My mind was directly below my feet. As an engineer, I knew the exact acoustic properties of every square inch of this house. I mentally counted Justin's footsteps as he descended into the dark. 12 wooden steps, a short pause at the bottom landing, the heavy squeak of his rubber soles walking across the bare concrete floor. Then absolute silence. He was standing directly over the hidden work area now. He was pulling back the heavy rubber mat. Monica poured the hot coffee. Her hands were shaking noticeably. She spilled a few dark drops of hot liquid onto the pristine white counter. She let out a high-pitched, nervous little laugh and quickly wiped it up with a paper towel, scrubbing the spot much harder than necessary. She started talking rapidly about a luxury vacation they were planning to take to the Bahamas. She described the expensive oceanfront resorts and the white sand beaches in excruciating detail. She was trying so hard to keep my attention focused entirely on her face to ensure I did not notice anything else. Underneath her rapid, breathless chatter, I finally heard it. A low, vibrating hum began to resonate through the thick floorboards beneath my kitchen chair. It was faint, but to a man who spent 40 years on construction sites, it was completely unmistakable. It was the heavy, grinding growl of an industrial rotary hammer drill. Justin was not using standard household tools. He had brought commercial-grade masonry equipment designed to chew through solid foundations. I took a slow, careful sip of my coffee and looked right into Monica's eyes. I smiled gently and told her the Bahamas sounded absolutely wonderful, and I truly hoped they would have a very relaxing time together. Monica smiled back broadly, but her eyes looked absolutely terrified. She was straining her own ears, trying to gauge the noise from downstairs, terrified that I would notice the mechanical rumble. She started speaking even louder, practically shouting her words, asking me if I wanted another powdered pastry. Down in the basement, the deep tone of the drill abruptly changed. It went from a low concrete rumble to a sharp, high-pitched metallic whine. Justin had made it through the outer layer, and the heavy carbide drill bit was now grinding directly against the thick, hardened steel of the vault door. He was desperately trying to bore a hole straight through the complex locking mechanism. It is a loud, violent, chaotic process. The aggressive vibrations traveled up the wooden support beams of the house. The hot coffee in my ceramic mug trembled slightly, creating tiny concentric ripples on the dark surface. I pointed down at my mug with a confused look and told Monica the house must be settling again because I could feel the old floors shaking. Monica laughed loudly and hysterically, practically choking on her breath. She insisted that old houses always make strange noises and vibrate with the wind. She quickly and clumsily changed the subject to her new expensive yoga class. I sat back and watched her sweat. I watched the frantic, suffocating panic in her posture. She was a willing accomplice to the robbery of her own family, and she was completely terrified the entire plan was about to collapse. She had absolutely no idea the vault beneath her feet was completely empty. She had no idea her husband was currently destroying a $1,000 drill bit against an impenetrable steel plate for absolutely nothing. The high-pitched, agonizing grinding continued for another endless 5 minutes. I kept making polite, innocent small talk, forcing Monica to maintain direct eye contact with me. I asked her complex questions that required long, detailed answers. I made her describe the specific yoga poses and the breathing exercises. I kept her completely trapped in her own agonizing web of deception, making her sweat through every single second of the ordeal. Then the violent noise abruptly stopped. The sudden, absolute silence in the house was far more deafening than the screaming drill. The heavy vibration beneath my feet vanished instantly. Monica stopped talking right in the middle of a sentence. She froze completely still, holding a half-eaten pastry in her trembling hand. We both sat there in the quiet, sunny kitchen. I knew exactly what that dead silence meant. Justin had not drilled through the lock. No portable battery-operated drill could pierce that specific military-grade steel in 5 minutes. He had realized the total futility of his tools, and he had noticed the concrete plug was already loose because I had removed it days prior. I mentally pictured him down there, in the dark, damp air. He was pulling the heavy steel door open. He was reaching his greedy, shaking hands down into the black cavity, fully expecting to feel the thick, bundled stacks of bearer bonds that would save his life. Instead, his frantic fingers were brushing against a single thin piece of paper. I took another calm, slow sip of my coffee. I asked Monica if everything was all right, because she looked a little pale and unwell. She swallowed hard, her throat clicking audibly, and forced a weak, sickly smile, saying she just felt a little lightheaded from the strong coffee. Heavy, slow, dragging footsteps began to ascend the wooden basement stairs. They were not the quick, eager, energetic steps of a man who had just secured his stolen fortune. They were the slow, agonizing steps of a man walking directly to his own execution. The wooden basement door slowly clicked open. Justin walked into the bright kitchen. The physical transformation in his appearance was absolutely shocking. His expensive designer shirt was completely soaked through with dark, heavy sweat clinging to his chest. His face was entirely devoid of all color, looking like a sheet of wet gray paper. His hands hung loosely and uselessly at his sides, trembling uncontrollably. His eyes were wide and filled with a raw, suffocating animal panic. He looked exactly like a man who had just looked directly into an open grave and realized it was dug specifically for him. He was clutching something tightly in his right fist. It was a crumpled, bright yellow sticky note. Monica stood up quickly, her wooden chair scraping loudly and violently against the floor. She took one single look at her husband, and the fake, cheerful smile vanished completely from her face. She asked him what was wrong, her voice cracking with fear. She asked him if he was okay. Justin did not answer her. He could not even look at his wife. His wide, terrified eyes were fixed entirely on me. I sat comfortably in my chair, holding my warm mug of coffee. I did not look angry. I did not look surprised or betrayed. I looked at him with the calm, absolute patience of an architect who was watching his perfectly designed building perform exactly as intended. I offered him a warm smile and gently asked him if he managed to fix the flickering porch light. Justin opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked down at the crushed yellow paper in his shaking hand and then slowly looked back up at me. In that exact silent moment, the entire illusion shattered completely. He finally realized the terrifying truth. He was not the clever predator creeping through the house of a weak, senile old man. He was a small, desperate rat who had just realized he was sitting in the exact center of a massive, inescapable trap. And he knew with absolute certainty that I was the one holding the cage closed. Monday passed in absolute silence. My son did not call me to apologize. His wife did not call to explain. The house remained completely quiet all day and all night. But as a man who spent 40 years studying the structural integrity of massive buildings, I know that when a failing structure suddenly stops groaning, it does not mean the danger has passed. It usually means the critical load has shifted to a completely different support beam right before the final catastrophic collapse. Justin had failed to physically breach the steel floor safe in my basement. He was completely out of time. The violent underground debt collector he brought into my home was breathing down his neck, demanding $50,000 that my son simply did not have. A desperate, terrified man will always look for the path of least resistance. I just never anticipated that his next weapon of choice would be the family court system itself. Tuesday morning arrived with a heavy gray overcast that blocked out the sun. At exactly 10 o'clock, the doorbell rang with a sharp, sudden chime. I checked the hidden security monitors in my bedroom. The person standing on my front porch was not Justin. It was not the heavy-set enforcer with the iron crowbar. It was a middle-aged woman wearing a sharp gray business suit. She had her hair pulled back into a tight professional bun, and she was carrying a thick leather briefcase. She looked entirely official, tired, and completely out of place on my quiet suburban street. I unlocked the heavy deadbolt and opened the front door. The woman introduced herself with a crisp, polite tone. She said she was an independent court-appointed medical evaluator working directly for the county family court. She held up a thick stack of legal documents stamped with heavy red ink. She looked me directly in the eyes and explained that she was here because my son had filed an emergency ex parte petition for adult guardianship. I stood there in the doorway, letting the cold morning air wash over my face, while the sheer gravity of those words settled into my bones. Guardianship. It is a sterile, clinical, legal word, but in reality it is an absolute death sentence for a person's independence. If a family court judge grants a full medical and financial guardianship, the state completely strips away every single one of your civil rights. You are legally reduced to the status of a helpless toddler. You can no longer vote in an election. You cannot sign a legal contract. You cannot manage your own bank accounts or sell your own property. You cannot even decide what medical treatments you want to receive. And the person who is given absolute total control over your entire existence is the appointed guardian. In this case, it would be my son. Justin was actively trying to legally erase my autonomy so he could take the literal keys to my kingdom. He wanted to own my house, my finances, and my very freedom. I stepped back from the door and politely welcomed the evaluator into my home. I kept my voice perfectly calm and measured. I offered her a cup of fresh coffee and asked her to have a seat on the comfortable sofa in my living room. She thanked me, unzipped her leather briefcase, and pulled out the sworn legal affidavit Justin had filed with the judge just 24 hours earlier. It was an absolute masterpiece of desperate, terrified fiction. She began to read this document out loud to me. According to my son's sworn testimony, I had developed severe aggressive paranoia over the past few weeks. He claimed my cognitive decline was rapid and dangerous. He wrote that I was constantly accusing my own loving family of trying to hurt me and steal from me. He claimed I had started hiding my assets, hoarding money, and locking my family out of the house. He specifically mentioned the incident in the basement from Sunday, framing it as a dangerous, psychotic delusion. He told the court that I had locked myself in the basement and was hallucinating about armed intruders while destroying my own property. The utter audacity of his lies was breathtaking. Justin was actively weaponizing my own defensive measures against me. He knew he could not crack the steel floor safe with physical tools. He knew he could not outsmart me in the dark. So he decided to use the immense crushing power of the family court system to simply bypass the locks completely. If the judge declared me mentally incompetent, Justin would not need a heavy industrial drill to open my vault. The state would simply hand him the combination. He would gain immediate legal access to my house and my entire estate. He could legally sell this house out from under me to pay off his illicit gambling debts. He could lock me away in a secure, locked memory care facility where no one would ever listen to my complaints. I would just be another crazy old man yelling at the walls while my son drained my life savings to save his own kneecaps. The evaluator looked at me over the top of her reading glasses. Her pen was hovering over her clipboard. She was watching my every single movement. She was looking for the aggressive paranoia Justin had so carefully described in his paperwork. She was looking for trembling hands, erratic speech, angry outbursts, or defensive posturing. I knew exactly how these psychological evaluations worked. If I acted angry right now, if I raised my voice and accused my son of being a criminal liar, I would sound exactly like the paranoid, delusional old man Justin had painted me out to be. Anger is the absolute worst enemy you can have during a mental competency evaluation. It validates every single lie the petitioner has told, so I did not get angry. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I sat back in my leather armchair, crossed my legs, and offered the woman a warm, gentle, understanding smile. I told her that I completely understood her position, and that I respected the fact that she was simply doing her job to protect vulnerable elderly people in the community. I thanked her for taking the time out of her busy schedule to come out and speak with me personally to get the real story. I spoke with the clear, precise diction of a man who spent his entire life calculating mathematical structural loads. I kept my body language completely open and relaxed. I watched the tense professional guard slowly leave her shoulders as she realized she was not sitting across from a volatile, confused dementia patient. She was sitting across from a perfectly sane, articulate, and highly intelligent retired engineer. She began asking me the standard cognitive baseline questions required by the court. She asked me the current date, the name of the president, the exact street address of my home, and asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens. I answered every single question flawlessly without a single moment's hesitation. My mind was completely sharp. Then she lowered her clipboard slightly and asked me the most important question of the morning. She asked me why my own son would go through the extreme trouble of filing such a serious legal document, claiming I was hiding money and acting paranoid if none of it was true. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee. The silence in the living room stretched out for a few long seconds. This was the critical pivot point of the entire war. I could simply deny his allegations, and it would become a messy, complicated battle of his word against mine in a courtroom. A conservative judge might still side with a seemingly concerned younger son over an elderly father just to be absolutely safe. I needed to completely demolish Justin's credibility right here in my living room in a way that left absolutely no room for judicial doubt. I looked the evaluator directly in the eyes. The warmth left my expression replaced by a deep, profound sorrow. I told her that my son was not lying about the fact that there was a severe, dangerous problem in our family right now. But I told her he was completely lying about who the actual problem was. I explained that I was not suffering from any form of paranoia. I was suffering from the heartbreaking realization that my only child was in severe illicit financial trouble and was willing to do absolutely anything to silence me and steal my assets. I told her I was completely sane, and more importantly, I could prove every single word I was saying with absolute, undeniable empirical data. I told the evaluator that I would provide the empirical data right now. I stood up from my leather armchair and walked over to my solid oak desk. I unlocked the top drawer and pulled out a thick, bound leather ledger. This was not a shoebox full of crumpled receipts or a disorganized pile of bank statements that a confused elderly man might keep. This was the meticulous financial diary of a structural engineer. I walked back to the sofa and gently placed the heavy book on the coffee table right next to her legal notepad. I asked her to open it. She put her pen down and carefully opened the heavy cover. Inside, she found decades of perfectly balanced accounts written in clear, sharp black ink. Every single utility bill, every grocery run, every property tax payment was categorized and indexed to the exact penny. I sat back down and explained that a man suffering from severe cognitive decline does not maintain a flawless, triple-checked accounting system. I watched her eyes scan the crisp pages. The professional skepticism on her face began to melt away rapidly. She flipped through month after month of perfect mathematical precision. She looked up at me and her posture was completely different now. She was no longer looking at a potential ward of the state. She was looking at a man who was entirely in control of his domain. She nodded slowly and admitted that my financial records were immaculate. But a clean ledger only proved I could do basic math. It did not explain the severe allegations of paranoia my son had sworn to under penalty of perjury. She closed the heavy book and leaned forward. She told me that financial competence was only one half of the evaluation. She reminded me that Justin had filed a sworn affidavit claiming I was hallucinating about armed men in my basement and locking my family out of the house for no reason. She asked me directly why a successful, educated young man would completely fabricate such a bizarre and specific story. I kept my voice incredibly soft and steady. I told her that fear is only considered paranoia when the threat does not actually exist. When the threat is real and standing right inside your home, it is not paranoia. It is survival. I reached into the inner pocket of my cardigan and pulled out the encrypted digital tablet. The screen was completely black. I rested it on the table right on top of the legal documents she had brought into my house. I looked at her and said I was about to show her exactly why my son was so desperate to take away my legal rights. I unlocked the screen with my fingerprint and opened the secure video file from Wednesday night. I turned the volume up to maximum and slid the device across the smooth wood of the coffee table. The screen lit up her face with a pale, ghostly glow. She leaned in closer, her brow furrowing in confusion. The high-definition night vision footage began to play. She watched as the front door of my house opened in the pitch black. She watched Justin, my own flesh and blood, sneak into the living room. Then she saw the massive, heavy-set stranger walk in right behind him, gripping the solid iron crowbar. The evaluator gasped softly, putting her hand over her mouth. I did not say a word. I just let the evidence do the heavy lifting. The video shifted to the basement stairwell camera. The audio was crystal clear in the quiet living room. The heavy grinding hum of the thermal scanner echoed through the small speakers. She watched the violent debt collector back my son against the concrete wall. And then she heard the audio. She heard my son laugh, a cold, dismissive laugh. She heard him tell the armed criminal that his old man was completely losing his mind and would never even notice the money was gone. She heard him completely fabricate the narrative of my dementia right there on tape specifically to cover up his planned burglary. The evaluator sat completely frozen on my sofa. The color had completely drained from her face. She was a professional who dealt with messy family disputes every single day, but she rarely saw such raw, undeniable proof of pure malice. The video ended, and the screen faded back to black. The heavy silence in my living room was thick enough to cut with a knife. She looked away from the dark screen and looked at me. Her eyes were wide with absolute horror. I leaned forward and folded my hands together. I explained the situation to her with absolute cold clarity. I told her that my son owed a massive illicit debt to dangerous underground criminals. He brought an armed enforcer into my home in the middle of the night to steal my life savings from a hidden vault. When he realized he could not break through the steel physically, he panicked. I told her the emergency guardianship petition was not a desperate plea for medical help. It was a legal crowbar. He was trying to use the family court system to legally bypass my locks to declare me incompetent, so he could drain my accounts and save his own life. He was committing textbook elder abuse and attempted robbery, and he was trying to make her and the judge his unwitting accomplices. The evaluator did not ask me any more cognitive baseline questions. She did not ask me to count backward or remember the date. She picked up her pen, but her hand was shaking with a furious professional anger. She asked me if I had a copy of that video file for her official records. I nodded and handed her a small silver encrypted thumb drive that I had prepared that morning. She took it and dropped it into her leather briefcase like it was a live grenade. She stood up from the sofa, her entire demeanor completely transformed. She was no longer a neutral observer. She was a furious officer of the court who had just realized she was being used as a weapon in a violent crime. She looked at me and apologized sincerely for bringing that fraudulent paperwork into my home. She told me she was going back to the courthouse immediately. She promised me that the emergency petition was effectively dead. She was going to file an immediate red flag report in the state system, permanently freezing Justin's legal maneuver and blocking him from ever filing a similar motion again. She also told me she was legally mandated to report the attempted burglary and the elder abuse to the district attorney. I walked her to the front door and thanked her for her diligence. I watched her practically run down my front steps and get into her car. She drove away with the absolute undeniable proof of my son's crimes locked in her briefcase. Justin had gambled everything on the sheer weight of the legal system crushing my independence before I could mount a defense. He thought he could bury me under a mountain of legal paperwork and false testimony, but he forgot that a master engineer always builds redundancy into his structures. I did not fight the court. I simply handed the court the exact tools they needed to completely dismantle my son. The legal threat was entirely neutralized. My autonomy was perfectly secure. But more importantly, the system was now actively hunting Justin. His desperate attempt to corner me had just triggered an avalanche that was about to bury him alive. The sound of the evaluator's car driving away was the starting gun for the final phase of my plan. Justin had tried to bury me legally, but he had completely failed. Now I was going to bury him financially. I walked back into my house and locked the door. I did not sit down. I walked straight to my oak desk and opened the heavy leather ledger. Justin lived his entire life draped in an expensive illusion. He drove a luxury German sport utility vehicle. He lived in a towering downtown penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows. He and Monica ate at restaurants where a single steak cost more than my weekly grocery budget. But that entire lifestyle was a fragile house of cards built entirely on the solid concrete foundation of my good credit and my silent financial backing. He thought I was just a safety net. He was about to find out that I was the entire high wire. I picked up the phone and dialed the number for my corporate wireless provider. Years ago, I had put Justin and Monica on my business account to save them some money when they were first starting out. They never offered to take over the bill, and I had never asked them to. It was just another silent subsidy. I gave the customer service representative my secure PIN and told her I needed to make an immediate change to the account. I instructed her to completely sever the 2 secondary phone lines effective immediately. I did not suspend them or pause them. I had the numbers permanently deactivated and released back into the public pool. In less than 3 minutes, the smartphones they used to run their entire lives became useless pieces of glass and metal. Next, I pulled out the thick folder containing my comprehensive insurance policies. I called my broker, a man I had known for over 2 decades. I told him I was restructuring my liabilities. I instructed him to immediately cancel the comprehensive auto insurance policies tied to both of Justin's luxury vehicles. Those cars were leased, and the terms of the lease explicitly required full premium coverage at all times. By dropping the insurance, I was instantly putting Justin in direct violation of his incredibly expensive auto lease. The dealership would receive an automated electronic notification from the state within 48 hours, and they would immediately dispatch a recovery team to repossess the vehicles. Finally, I pulled out the most important document of all. 3 years ago, Justin had begged me to co-sign the lease for his downtown penthouse. He claimed his income was completely fine, but the building management was just being overly strict about credit history. I knew it was a lie even then, but I had signed the paperwork anyway, hoping a nice home would help him settle down. I found the contact number for the property management group and dialed it. I asked to speak directly to the senior leasing director. I identified myself and stated clearly and officially that I was formally withdrawing my name as the financial guarantor for the penthouse lease due to a severe breach of trust. The director sounded surprised, but confirmed that without my financial backing, Justin did not meet the strict income requirements to remain in the building. She informed me that she would have to issue an immediate demand for a massive cash security deposit or an eviction notice by the end of the business day. I told her to do exactly what her corporate policy dictated. This was not petty revenge. I was not doing this to be cruel or spiteful. I was a structural engineer dismantling a hazardous building. When a structure becomes a dangerous liability, you do not just knock it down blindly. You systematically sever the utility lines. You cut the power. You shut off the water. You isolate the hazard completely before you let it fall. Justin had brought a violent criminal into my orbit because he could not manage his own life. I was simply removing my structural support and letting gravity do the rest. The immediate consequences of my actions hit them faster than I could have ever anticipated. It was just past 1 in the afternoon. Monica was sitting in a high-end bistro downtown having a lavish lunch with 2 of her friends. She had ordered expensive champagne and a towering seafood platter, completely oblivious to the legal disaster her husband had just caused at my house. When the waiter brought the leather folio with the bill, Monica casually handed him her platinum credit card. The card was linked directly to a joint account that I had quietly frozen earlier that morning. A few minutes later, the waiter returned. He looked incredibly uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. He leaned in and spoke quietly so the other tables would not hear. He told Monica her card had been completely declined. Monica laughed loudly, a sharp, embarrassed sound, and told him their machine must be broken. She reached into her designer purse and pulled out her smartphone, intending to open her banking application to show him her balance. But when she looked at the screen, she saw the dreaded notification. No service. She tried to make a call to Justin, but the phone just gave a series of dead, hollow beeps. She was completely stranded in an expensive restaurant, unable to pay her bill, unable to call for help, and entirely stripped of her wealthy facade in front of her judgmental friends. At that exact same moment, Justin was sitting in his corner office miles away. He was frantically pacing back and forth, waiting for the court evaluator to call him with the good news that his father had been locked away. Instead, his office phone rang. It was not the courthouse. It was the leasing office downstairs. The director informed him coldly that his financial guarantor had withdrawn completely. She demanded a cashier's check for $20,000 by 5 o'clock, or they would begin formal eviction proceedings the following morning. Justin slammed the office phone down in an absolute blind panic. He reached into his pocket and grabbed his cell phone, intending to call me to scream and demand answers. But his screen showed the exact same dead signal as Monica's. He stared at the useless device, the terrifying reality finally crashing down on him. I had not just outsmarted his legal trap. I had reached across the city and completely disconnected his entire life. And then the most terrifying thing of all happened. The heavy mahogany door to his private office slowly clicked open. His secretary was not standing there. It was Vince. The massive underground debt collector had bypassed the front desk entirely. He stepped into the office and closed the door quietly behind him. Vince did not look angry. He looked completely dead inside. He looked at Justin and asked why his cell phone was suddenly disconnected right when he was supposed to be delivering $50,000. Justin was completely trapped. He had no phone. He had no car insurance. He was about to be evicted. And the violent enforcer he had hired to rob me was now locking him inside his own office. The structural collapse was happening in real time, and there was absolutely nothing left to hold the roof up. The afternoon sky turned a bruised purple as the sun began to set behind the trees. I was standing by the kitchen window looking out at the quiet street. A battered yellow city taxi pulled up to the curb in front of my house. The back door swung open, and Monica stepped out. This was not the arrogant, polished woman who had sat in my kitchen just a few days ago eating expensive pastries and lying to my face. The pristine facade had completely crumbled. She was wearing the same designer silk blouse from her lunch, but it was wrinkled and stained. Her expensive leather shoes scuffed the pavement as she practically fell out of the cab. She did not have her luxury sports car because my phone call had already set the repossession in motion. She looked frantic, pacing the sidewalk while arguing with the taxi driver. She must have scraped together every last crumpled dollar bill in her purse just to pay the fare. The cab sped away, leaving her standing alone on my driveway. She looked up at the house with wide, desperate eyes. She ran up the front steps and began pounding on the heavy oak door. She did not even bother to use the doorbell. She just hit the wood with the flat of her hands. I walked slowly to the entryway and checked the security monitor. Her makeup was completely ruined, running down her cheeks in dark, thick streaks. Her perfectly styled hair was a tangled mess clinging to her sweaty forehead. I took a slow, deep breath, composing my features into the mask of a bewildered and concerned father. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Monica practically collapsed into the hallway. She fell to her knees on the hardwood floor, sobbing hysterically and clutching at the fabric of my trousers. The smell of expensive floral perfume was completely overshadowed by the sharp, acrid scent of pure animal panic. I reached down and gently pulled her up to her feet, playing the role of the soft-hearted old man perfectly. I guided her into the living room and helped her sit down on the sofa. She buried her face in her hands and let out a long, agonizing wail. It was a very good performance. If I had not seen the security footage of her husband trying to drill into my floor safe, I might have actually felt sorry for her. She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen, and began to speak in a rushed, breathless panic. She confessed everything, but she carefully spun the narrative to make themselves look like helpless victims. She told me Justin had made some terrible mistakes with a local sports betting syndicate. She claimed they were completely in over their heads, and that a violent debt collector named Vince was currently sitting in Justin's downtown office. Monica grabbed my hands. Her fingers were ice cold and trembling violently. She told me Vince had locked the office door and given them a final, absolute ultimatum. If they did not produce $50,000 in cash by midnight, Vince was going to permanently cripple my son. She described the threats in graphic, terrifying detail, hoping to trigger my paternal instincts. She said Justin was terrified and that his cell phone was somehow disconnected, so he could not even call the police. I knew exactly why his phone was dead, but I just nodded slowly, keeping my expression full of gentle, horrific shock. Monica dropped to her knees again right there on the living room rug. She begged me for a financial bailout. She promised me they would change their lives completely. She swore on her own life that if I saved them just this one last time, they would immediately check themselves into a strict rehabilitation clinic. She promised they would sell all their expensive clothes, move into a small, modest apartment, and go to counseling every single week. I looked down at her, listening to the endless stream of desperate, empty promises. My engineering mind analyzed every single word she said. I knew she did not mean a single syllable of it. She was not crying because she felt guilty for betraying me. She was crying because her credit cards were declined. Her social status was evaporating, and a criminal was threatening her comfortable lifestyle. She was using my love for my son as a crowbar to pry open my wallet. She assumed that no father could ever stand by and let his child be physically destroyed, even if that child was a thief. She was banking her entire survival on my perceived emotional weakness. She thought I was soft. She thought I was a fragile old man who would blindly hand over his life savings to protect his family. I let a long, heavy silence fill the room. I looked away from her and stared at the floor, letting my shoulders sag, as if the weight of her words had completely broken my spirit. I let out a long, tired sigh. I told her in a quiet, trembling voice that I was profoundly disappointed in both of them. I told her I never raised my son to be a liar or a thief. I made sure my voice cracked just a little bit at the end of the sentence. Monica nodded frantically, tears streaming down her face, agreeing with everything I said, playing the role of the penitent sinner. I slowly stood up from the sofa and walked over to my heavy oak desk in the corner of the room. I unlocked the bottom drawer and pulled out a dark blue leather checkbook. This was not my primary checking account. This was a specialized high-security account I had set up years ago specifically for large corporate transfers. Earlier that morning, I had deliberately logged into the secure banking portal and flagged this specific account for mandatory 72-hour fraud holds on all outgoing paper transactions. It was a security measure designed to protect elderly clients from financial exploitation. I brought the checkbook back to the coffee table and sat down. I pulled a silver pen from my pocket. Monica stopped crying instantly. Her breath hitched in her throat as she watched the tip of my pen touch the crisp paper. I wrote out the date with slow, deliberate strokes. I wrote her name on the payee line, ensuring every letter was perfectly legible. Then I moved to the amount box. I wrote the number 50, followed by 3 zeros. On the line below, I spelled out the words $50,000 exactly. The scratching sound of the pen nib against the paper was the only sound in the entire house. Monica was leaning forward so far, she was practically hovering over the coffee table. Her eyes were locked onto the blue slip of paper with a hungry, desperate intensity. The terrified wife was suddenly gone, replaced entirely by a greedy predator watching a piece of fresh meat fall into her trap. I signed my name at the bottom corner, using my formal legal signature. I tore the check slowly from the binding. The sharp ripping sound echoed in the quiet room. I held the small piece of paper between my fingers. I looked directly into Monica's eyes. I did not smile. I gave her a look of utter, absolute heartbreak. I told her this was the very last time I would ever help them. I told her she was taking the last of my retirement security. I held the check out toward her. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped completely. Monica snatched the check from my fingers with the lightning speed of a striking snake. She did not express profound gratitude. She did not hug me or thank me for saving her husband's life. She just stared at the numbers on the paper. A brief, unmistakable flash of pure, triumphant victory washed over her face. She had done it. In her mind, she had successfully manipulated the weak, senile old man. She had played the perfect victim and walked away with a small fortune. She quickly folded the check and shoved it deep into her designer purse. She stood up, smoothing her wrinkled silk blouse. She gave me a quick, hollow promise that she would call me from the hospital tomorrow, and ran straight for the front door. She did not look back. I listened to the heavy door slam shut behind her. I walked over to the window and watched her practically sprint down the street, clutching her purse to her chest. She was running toward the bank, completely unaware that she was carrying a useless piece of paper. She thought she had outsmarted the architect. She thought she had secured the structural support to keep her fake life from collapsing. But all she had really done was take the bait exactly as I had designed. I turned away from the window and walked back into my quiet living room. The snare had officially closed around her ankle. The clock was ticking toward midnight, and my son and his wife were about to find out exactly what happens when a bridge is built on absolute lies. I watched from my living room window as Monica disappeared down the street. She was moving with frantic, desperate energy, but in her mind, she was already celebrating a massive victory. She thought she was holding the golden ticket that would magically fix her entire life. She did not know that she was actually carrying a highly calibrated time bomb right into the center of her own financial world. I walked back to my kitchen and poured out the cold coffee I had been drinking. I rinsed the ceramic mug in the sink, watching the dark liquid swirl down the drain. That was exactly what was happening to my son's life, right at that very moment. I did not need to follow her to know exactly how the next hour was going to play out. I had designed the mechanism flawlessly, and human greed is the most predictable force on earth. Monica had to find another taxi to get to her bank branch downtown. She was racing against the clock because it was late afternoon, and the retail banking branches would be locking their heavy glass doors very soon. I could easily picture her sitting in the back of the cab, her hands shaking, as she clutched her expensive designer purse to her chest. Inside that purse was a piece of blue paper with my signature and a $50,000 promise. She probably spent that entire cab ride visualizing how she was going to walk into her husband's office and throw the cash on the desk. She probably imagined the look of relief on his face and the way the violent debt collector would finally back down and leave them alone. She thought her nightmare was over. She was completely wrong. It was just entering its final, most destructive phase. She would have rushed through the heavy revolving doors of the bank just minutes before closing time. The lobby would have been quiet with only a few customers left and the security guard checking his watch. Monica would have walked straight up to the premium teller line demanding immediate service. She was used to being treated like royalty because of her husband's fake wealth. She would have pulled the blue check out of her purse and slid it across the polished marble counter with a trembling, triumphant smile. She would have told the teller she needed the entire amount cleared and available for immediate cash withdrawal right that very second. The teller, a young professional trained to be polite and efficient, would have picked up the check and looked at the amount. $50,000 is a significant transaction for a late afternoon walk-in customer. The teller would have asked for her identification and her platinum account debit card. Monica would have handed them over, eagerly tapping her expensive shoes on the marble floor, impatient and arrogant. Then the teller would have slid the blue check into the electronic scanning machine. That was the exact moment the trap I had so carefully engineered finally snapped shut around her neck. Earlier that morning, I had deliberately logged into my secure corporate banking portal. I had placed a permanent mandatory 72-hour fraud review hold on that specific account. It is a highly specialized security protocol designed specifically to prevent the financial exploitation of senior citizens. Any paper check written from that account over the amount of $5,000 automatically triggers a massive internal security alert the moment it is scanned by any receiving bank. The system completely locks down the transaction and flags the account for intense manual review by the corporate fraud department. There are no overrides. There are no exceptions. Not even a branch manager can authorize the release of the funds. It is a completely airtight financial quarantine. I knew exactly what happened next because the bank manager called me the very next morning to verify the incident. The teller looked at her computer screen and saw a bright flashing red banner drop across her monitor. The system locked up instantly. The keyboard became unresponsive. The teller frowned, confused, and tried to process the transaction again, but the terminal was completely frozen. She looked up at Monica and politely asked her to wait just one moment while she called her supervisor over to look at an error code. Monica would have felt the first icy drop of real panic slide down her spine. The triumphant smile would have vanished from her face. She would have demanded to know what was taking so long, complaining that she was in a massive hurry and had a life or death emergency. But the teller just stepped back and signaled for the branch manager. The manager, a stern older woman in a tailored suit, would have walked over and looked at the frozen terminal. She would have seen the severe fraud alert tied directly to the check routing numbers. The manager would have turned to Monica and delivered the absolute crushing blow. She would have explained in a calm, professional voice that the check was drawn from a high-security account, flagged for mandatory fraud prevention. She would have told Monica that the funds were completely locked and would not be available for at least 3 full business days pending a thorough legal investigation by the issuing bank. I can only imagine the sheer suffocating terror that must have exploded inside Monica's chest at that exact moment. She would have started screaming at the manager. She would have slammed her hands down on the marble counter demanding her money. She would have cried and begged and explained that her husband was in physical danger and that they needed the cash by midnight or someone was going to hurt him. But revealing that she was being extorted by a violent criminal would only make the bank manager even more suspicious. The manager would have stepped back from the angry, desperate woman. She would have informed Monica that bank policy strictly required them to physically confiscate any document tied to a severe fraud alert. The manager would have taken my blue check, placed it into a clear plastic evidence sleeve, and slipped it into a locked drawer right behind the teller station. Monica was completely disarmed. She had walked into the bank expecting to walk out with $50,000 in life-saving cash. Instead, she was standing in the middle of a quiet lobby screaming like a lunatic while the bank manager confiscated her only lifeline. She demanded they give the physical check back to her so she could try to cash it somewhere else, but the manager flatly refused. The security guard would have slowly walked over, resting his hand on his utility belt, asking Monica to lower her voice and leave the premises immediately. She had absolutely nothing left. No money, no check, no leverage. She would have stumbled backwards away from the teller counter, her breath coming in short, rapid gasps. She would have turned and run back out through the revolving glass doors and onto the busy downtown sidewalk. The sun was completely gone now. The streetlights were flickering on, casting long, dark shadows across the concrete. She would have looked down at her expensive gold watch. It was past 6 in the evening. The banks were all closed. The corporate offices were empty. There was absolutely no one left to call and nowhere left to run. My son and his wife had spent weeks plotting to steal my life savings. They had brought a violent enforcer into my home. They had tried to drill through solid steel. They had tried to legally declare me insane to strip away my human rights. And when all of that failed, they had tried to manipulate my love for them to extort a massive bailout. They were driven entirely by their own massive blinding greed, and I had used that exact same greed to completely destroy them. I did not need to fight them physically. I did not need to argue with them or beg them to be better people. I just gave them exactly what they wanted. I gave them a piece of paper that looked like a fortune but was actually a ticking clock. I gave them a false sense of absolute security so they would stop looking for other ways to survive. I delayed them. I wasted their incredibly precious time. I kept them distracted and hopeful right up until the very last possible second. Now the sun was down and the city was getting dark. Monica was standing on a cold sidewalk with an empty purse. Justin was sitting in a locked office with a disconnected phone and an angry, violent man who was tired of waiting for his money. The deadline was rapidly approaching. The $50,000 they desperately needed was sitting safely in my frozen account, entirely out of their reach. The guillotine had finally dropped, and there was absolutely no one left to stop the blade from falling. I turned off the kitchen light and walked back into my living room, feeling a deep, profound sense of quiet peace. The silent adjustment was almost complete. The night settled over the neighborhood like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The streetlights outside cast long, pale shadows across my front lawn. Inside the house, the air was completely still. I had spent the early evening making my final physical preparations. I walked into my master bedroom and closed the heavy, solid core wooden door behind me. I did not rely on the standard brass lock. I knelt on the floor and slid 2 thick industrial steel barricade brackets into the heavy metal mounts I had bolted directly into the floor joists years ago. A battering ram could hit that door, and the structural frame of the house would fail before the hinges gave way. I was completely sealed inside my own personal fortress. I turned off the bedside lamp, plunging the room into total darkness. The only light came from the glowing green screens of my encrypted surveillance tablet resting on my lap. I sat in my leather reading chair and waited. I did not have a weapon in my hands. I did not need one. My entire house was the weapon, and the trap was already fully armed. I knew exactly what was going to happen tonight. The fraud hold at the bank had completely severed Justin's last lifeline. He had failed to produce the $50,000, and the deadline was only hours away. The violent debt collector he had brought into my world was not a man who accepted apologies or bad checks. Justin was completely out of options, and a man with no options is reduced to his most basic feral instincts. At exactly 11:45, the suffocating silence of the house was violently shattered. It was not a stealthy turning of the doorknob or the quiet picking of a lock. It was an absolute explosion of brute force. A massive, jagged landscaping rock crashed straight through the large bay window in my living room. The heavy pane of double-reinforced glass shattered instantly, sending thousands of sharp, glittering shards raining down onto the hardwood floor. The sheer volume of the noise echoed through the empty house like a bomb detonating in a closed tunnel. I did not flinch. I sat perfectly still in my chair watching the camera feed. They were no longer trying to hide. They were no longer playing the role of sneaky burglars. This was a desperate, chaotic home invasion born of absolute, blind terror. Justin climbed clumsily through the broken window frame. He was moving with frantic, jerky motions. His expensive designer jacket caught on a large, jagged piece of glass still lodged in the window frame, tearing the fabric completely open. He did not even seem to notice. He stumbled into the living room, his chest heaving with heavy, panicked breaths. Vince came through the window right behind him. The massive underground debt collector was no longer carrying a simple crowbar. He was holding a thick, heavy wooden baseball bat. The professional calm he had displayed a few nights ago was completely gone. His face was twisted into a mask of pure, murderous rage. The moment his heavy boots hit the living room floor, he grabbed my son by the collar of his ruined jacket and shoved him violently against the drywall. The hidden microphones in the air vents picked up the audio perfectly. Vince was screaming at Justin, his voice a low, terrifying growl. He told my son that his stupid wife had tried to pass a fraudulent check at the bank downtown. He said his own associates had been waiting for the cash transfer, and now the people above him were incredibly angry. Vince pressed the thick wooden barrel of the bat hard against Justin's throat, pinning him to the wall. He told my son the debt had just doubled due to the delay. He gave Justin exactly 15 minutes to tear the house apart and find the hidden cash, or he was going to break both of his kneecaps right there on the living room rug. Vince dropped him to the floor. Justin scrambled to his feet, coughing and gasping for air. The absolute terror in his eyes was pathetic to watch. He looked like a cornered rat trapped in a burning building. He began to run wildly around the living room, tearing the space apart with his bare hands. He grabbed a heavy brass floor lamp and smashed it repeatedly against the drywall, hoping to find a hidden safe behind the plaster. He ripped the cushions off the sofa and threw them violently across the room. He pulled the books off my shelves by the handful, sending decades of literature crashing to the floor in a ruined heap. He ran into the kitchen and began pulling the wooden cabinets right off their hinges. These were the beautiful custom oak cabinets my late wife had picked out 30 years ago. He splintered the wood and let the heavy doors crash to the tile floor. He swept his arm across the dining room table, sending crystal glasses and porcelain plates shattering against the ground. He was tearing apart his own childhood home. He was systematically destroying the very family legacy he thought he was entitled to inherit. He pulled picture frames off the walls looking for hidden wall safes, completely ignoring the photographs of his own mother falling into the broken glass. It was a visceral, agonizing display of a man completely losing his mind. I watched him destroy thousands of dollars worth of property in a blind, sweaty panic. I felt absolutely no pity for him. Every piece of shattered glass and splintered wood was a testament to his own massive greed. He was paying the ultimate price for his arrogant assumptions. Vince followed him from room to room, pacing slowly like an executioner, waiting for the clock to run out. The large man periodically smashed the wooden bat against the kitchen counters, just to remind Justin that the threat of immense physical pain was looming over his head. Justin was sobbing now. Real heavy tears of absolute desperation streamed down his face, mixing with the sweat and the dirt. He had checked the living room, the dining room, the kitchen, and my downstairs office. He had found absolutely nothing. The house was completely stripped of anything valuable. I sat perfectly secure in my reinforced sanctuary, watching the monitors. They did not even attempt to come upstairs. Justin knew me far too well to bother with the bedrooms. He knew I was a structural engineer. He knew I would never keep hundreds of thousands of dollars stuffed under a mattress or hidden in a flimsy bedroom closet. He knew I built things to last, and he knew I built things heavy. He stood in the middle of the ruined kitchen, surrounded by the wreckage of his own life, breathing heavily. He looked at Vince and pointed a shaking finger toward the dark hallway that led to the basement door. He wiped his face with the back of his bleeding hand. He told the massive enforcer that the money had to be down below. He said the upstairs was just a decoy. He told Vince about the heavy concrete slab and the thick steel vault he had failed to drill through a few days ago. He promised the man that the real fortune was buried deep underground in the engineering workshop. Vince stared at him for a long, terrifying moment. He slowly lowered the wooden bat and nodded toward the hallway. He told Justin to lead the way and warned him that this was his absolute final chance. The two men turned away from the ruined kitchen and began walking slowly toward the basement door. I looked down at the control panel resting on my bedside table. I reached out and rested my finger right above a single heavy red toggle switch. They were finally moving toward the lowest level of the house. They were walking away from the broken windows and the open air, heading deep into the solid concrete foundation. They thought they were descending into a treasure room. They had absolutely no idea they were walking straight into the belly of the beast. The final trap was waiting for them in the dark, and I was more than ready to seal the door shut. I watched the glowing screen as the two men moved down the narrow hallway toward the basement stairs. Justin was in the lead, walking with a pathetic, shuffling gait, completely broken by fear. Vince walked closely behind him, gripping the heavy wooden bat, keeping a tight, brutal pressure on my son. The basement stairwell was illuminated only by the pale beam of a flashlight Vince held in his left hand. The light bounced wildly off the concrete walls, creating long, distorted shadows that danced across the steps. They reached the bottom landing and stopped. The space was completely dark except for the narrow beam of light cutting through the thick, musty air. Justin pointed toward the heavy, solid core door at the far end of the room. It was the entrance to my old engineering workshop. I had spent countless hours in that room drawing blueprints, testing materials, and seeking quiet refuge from the world. Now it was the epicenter of a violent home invasion. Justin told Vince that the real money had to be inside that specific room. He explained that I always kept it locked and that the walls were completely reinforced with poured concrete. He was feeding the violent enforcer exactly what he wanted to hear. He was desperately trying to buy himself a few more minutes of life by sacrificing my absolute privacy. Vince stepped past my son and walked right up to the heavy door. He did not bother to check the brass handle. He raised his massive right leg and kicked the center of the wood with a violent, explosive force. The standard deadbolt shattered instantly, sending splinters flying into the dark room. The door swung open, banging loudly against the interior concrete wall. The two men rushed inside, completely blind to the reality of their situation. The workshop was completely windowless. It was a perfectly sealed rectangular box deep underground. The walls, the floor, and the ceiling were all constructed of thick, industrial-grade concrete. The air inside was completely stagnant, smelling faintly of old paper and machine oil. Vince swept his flashlight rapidly around the room. The beam illuminated the dusty workbenches, the tall metal filing cabinets, and the heavy rubber mat covering the center of the floor. Justin practically fell to his knees, scrambling toward the mat. He remembered the thermal scan from a few nights ago. He remembered the hollow cavity buried in the foundation. He grabbed the edge of the rubber and pulled it back, exposing the heavy concrete plug. He looked up at Vince, his eyes wide with desperate, frantic hope. He pointed at the smooth square of concrete and practically screamed that the vault was right underneath it. He told Vince they just needed a heavy crowbar to pry the plug loose. Vince lowered the baseball bat slightly, a grim, cruel smile spreading across his face. He actually believed he had finally won. He thought the $50,000 was sitting right there waiting for him in the dark. I sat perfectly still in my dark bedroom watching the camera feed with absolute cold detachment. This was the moment I had engineered from the very beginning. This was the precise point where the structural load shifted from me entirely onto them. I did not need to run down the stairs and confront them with a weapon. I did not need to scream or negotiate. I simply reached out and rested my hand on the heavy metal control panel sitting on my bedside table. This panel was not connected to a standard home security system. It was a custom interface I had wired myself. Years ago, during the demolition of an old downtown bank building, I had salvaged several industrial magnetic door locks. These were massive, heavy-duty mechanisms designed to withstand thousands of pounds of sheer force. I had quietly installed those locks into the heavy steel frame of the workshop door. They were wired directly to an independent high-capacity battery backup, completely isolated from the main house power grid. Justin was still on his knee, frantically scratching at the edges of the concrete plug with his bleeding fingers. Vince was standing over him, illuminating the floor with the bright beam of his flashlight. They were completely focused on the floor, completely ignoring the heavy door standing open right behind them. I flipped the heavy red toggle switch on the control panel. The mechanism engaged with an incredibly violent mechanical clack. The sound was deafening in the quiet basement. It sounded like a massive steel trap snapping shut on a careless animal. The heavy solid core door slammed forward with incredible force driven by a specialized pneumatic closer I had installed specifically for this purpose. The door hit the steel frame with a massive thud, and the heavy magnetic locks engaged instantly, pulling the wood tight against the metal with an unbreakable, invisible grip. Vince spun around, dropping the flashlight. The beam rolled wildly across the concrete floor, casting dizzying shadows on the walls. He ran toward the door, his massive frame moving with surprising speed. He grabbed the heavy brass handle and pulled with all his strength. The door did not move a single millimeter. It was absolutely solid. It felt like pulling against a solid wall of poured concrete. He grunted in frustration and threw his entire body weight against the wood, hitting it with his heavy shoulder. The impact sent a dull thud echoing through the small room, but the door remained perfectly rigid. Justin scrambled backward away from the floor vault. He stared at the locked door, his face completely blank with shock. He had assumed I was asleep upstairs, completely oblivious to the chaos tearing my house apart. He finally realized that this was not a desperate burglary. It was a perfectly executed ambush. Vince stepped back from the door, his chest heaving. He picked up the heavy wooden baseball bat from the floor. He swung it with absolute murderous fury, smashing it directly into the center of the solid wood. The impact was deafening, but the door did not splinter or crack. The solid core construction absorbed the blow completely, leaving only a shallow dent in the surface. Vince hit the door again and again, screaming in blind rage, the sound of his voice echoing violently off the concrete walls. The workshop was completely soundproofed. I had designed it that way years ago so I could run heavy machinery late at night without disturbing my wife. Now that soundproofing was trapping the noise of their panic inside the room, turning the space into a suffocating echo chamber. I sat back in my leather chair and watched the chaos unfold on my monitor. The situation was completely secured. They had absolutely no way out. There were no windows to smash. The walls were too thick to break through. The door was held shut by thousands of pounds of magnetic force. They were perfectly trapped inside a concrete box deep underground. The dynamic inside the room shifted instantly. Vince stopped hitting the door. He turned around slowly, breathing heavily, his eyes burning with absolute raw fury. He looked directly at Justin. The violent enforcer realized he was not just trapped in a basement. He was locked in a cage with the very man who owed him $50,000. The man who had brought him to this house on a false promise. Justin backed away until his shoulders hit the cold concrete wall. He put his hands up, palms facing outward, a pathetic gesture of surrender. He begged Vince to calm down, promising him that there had to be a way out. He practically cried, swearing that he had no idea the room was rigged. But Vince was not listening to reason. He raised the heavy wooden bat, gripping the handle tightly with both hands. The trap had successfully neutralized the immediate physical threat to my safety, but it had simultaneously created an incredibly dangerous pressure cooker deep beneath my floorboards. The climax had arrived, and the absolute destruction of my son's life was no longer in my hands. It was entirely in his own. The night settled over the neighborhood like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The streetlights outside cast long, pale shadows across my front lawn. Inside the house, the air was completely still. I had spent the early evening making my final physical preparations. I walked into my master bedroom and closed the heavy, solid core wooden door behind me. I did not rely on the standard brass lock. I knelt on the floor and slid 2 thick industrial steel barricade brackets into the heavy metal mounts I had bolted directly into the floor joists years ago. A battering ram could hit that door, and the structural frame of the house would fail before the hinges gave way. I was completely sealed inside my own personal fortress. I turned off the bedside lamp, plunging the room into total darkness. The only light came from the glowing green screens of my encrypted surveillance tablet resting on my lap. Vince had the heavy wooden bat raised high above his head. His muscles were coiled tight, ready to bring the solid wood crashing down onto my son's shoulders. Justin was cowering against the cold concrete wall, sobbing uncontrollably with his arms wrapped around his head. The violence in the soundproof room was about to reach a catastrophic peak. I did not want a murder to happen inside my house. I just wanted absolute justice. I reached over to the heavy metal control panel on my nightstand. Next to the red toggle switch that controlled the magnetic locks was a small silver button. It activated the 2-way intercom system I had wired directly into the basement workshop years ago. I pressed my thumb down hard on the silver button. A sharp electronic crackle echoed loudly through the hidden speakers in the basement ceiling. The sudden burst of static was deafening in the enclosed concrete space. Vince froze instantly. The heavy wooden bat stopped in midair just inches above Justin's head. Both men snapped their heads upward, staring wildly at the dark ceiling. They were completely disoriented by the sudden intrusion of sound. I leaned in close to the microphone resting on my bedside table. I kept my voice incredibly low and completely devoid of any emotion. I did not yell. I did not sound angry. I sounded like an air traffic controller giving instructions to a plane that was already crashing. I spoke directly into the microphone, and my voice filled the underground room. I told them to stop exactly what they were doing. I told them that the room they were standing in was a custom-built structural vault. I explained that the door was sealed by industrial magnetic locks, pulling with 4,000 pounds of constant force. I told them that shooting the lock hitting the door or trying to pry the hinges would be completely useless. I spoke with the slow, deliberate cadence of a teacher explaining a simple math problem to a failing student. I told them that the ventilation system was on a separate circuit and would continue to pump fresh air into the room so they were not going to suffocate. But I made it absolutely clear that the door would never open from the inside. Down in the basement, Vince slowly lowered the baseball bat. His massive chest was heaving as my words echoed off the concrete walls. He looked at the heavy door, and then he looked back up at the ceiling. The violent enforcer suddenly realized that all his physical strength was completely useless. He could break every bone in Justin's body, but it would not open that door. He was no longer the apex predator in the room. He was just another rat caught in the exact same trap. And he knew with absolute certainty that the man who had dragged him into this cage was shivering right next to him. Vince dropped the wooden bat. It hit the concrete floor with a heavy, hollow clatter. He grabbed Justin by the front of his torn jacket and lifted him entirely off his feet. Vince slammed my son against the wall. He did not hit him. He just held him there, pinning him against the cold gray stone. Vince screamed into Justin's face, demanding that he fix the situation. He told Justin to beg his father to open the door. He told him to say whatever he had to say to get them out of that concrete coffin before he tore him apart with his bare hands. Justin was completely broken. The physical threat from Vince combined with the psychological horror of being buried alive by his own father snapped the last remaining threads of his sanity. He looked up at the tiny black camera lens hidden in the corner ventilation grate. He knew I was watching. He knew I was listening to every single agonizing breath he took. He started to scream. He did not ask for a negotiation. He did not demand a lawyer. He just started verbally vomiting every single toxic secret he had been holding inside. He screamed that he was sorry. He screamed that the $50,000 debt was real and that Vince was going to kill him. He begged me to just open the door and let Vince walk away. I pressed the silver button on my nightstand again. I told Justin that an apology was not a currency I accepted anymore. I told him that if he wanted to breathe the outside air again, I needed to know exactly what kind of man I was letting out of my basement. I demanded the absolute truth, every single detail, every single lie. Justin completely unraveled. He clung to the concrete wall, crying hysterically, and began to confess to absolutely everything. The soundproof acoustics of the room captured his voice perfectly. He confessed that he and Monica had been completely broke for over a year. He admitted that the European vacations and the luxury cars were all funded by massive, high-interest illegal loans. He confessed to bringing Vince into the house on Wednesday night to use the thermal scanner. He admitted that he had planned to steal my entire life savings and use my age as an excuse if the police ever got involved. He did not stop there. The fear of the massive man standing right next to him pushed him to reveal crimes I did not even know about. He confessed that he had forged my signature on multiple financial documents over the past 6 months, trying to secure secondary lines of credit against his own penthouse. He admitted that the emergency guardianship petition was a complete fabrication engineered entirely to strip away my human rights so he could legally force the sale of my home. He cried so hard he could barely breathe, choking on his own tears as he detailed the sheer depth of his betrayal. He confessed that he had told Monica to lie to me to play on my sympathies, to extract the $50,000 check. He laid his entire rotten soul bare under the harsh fluorescent lights of the concrete room. Upstairs, in the absolute safety of my dark bedroom, I was not just listening. I was completely securing my victory. A thick black audio cable ran directly from the receiver on my nightstand into a secure, encrypted hard drive resting on the floor. I watched the digital audio waves spike and fall on the monitor as Justin screamed out his confession. Every single word of his pathetic pleading, every specific detail of his financial crimes and elder abuse was being permanently recorded, encoded, and backed up to a redundant cloud server. I sat in my leather chair completely detached from the emotional horror unfolding below me. I did not feel a single drop of sympathy for the boy crying on the screen. The son I had raised died the moment he brought a man with a weapon into the home where his mother had lived. The creature trapped in my basement was just a dangerous parasite that had finally been isolated from the host. Justin finished his confession. He slid down the concrete wall and collapsed onto the floor, curling into a tight, pathetic ball. He sobbed into his hands, begging me to call the police, to call the fire department, to call anyone to get them out. Vince just stood there, staring at the ceiling camera, his face pale, recognizing the absolute finality of the trap. He knew he was going to prison. He knew the audio recording was the end of his freedom. The basement workshop was no longer an engineering room. It was a holding cell. The psychological destruction was complete. The evidence was secured. There was only one final step left to take. I removed my finger from the silver intercom button and stepped away from the nightstand. The basement was immediately plunged back into complete acoustic isolation. I did not need to hear another single word from my son. The confession was perfectly secured on the encrypted hard drive resting near my feet. I picked up the heavy black receiver of my bedside telephone and dialed 911. I did not speak with the cold, calculated precision of the engineer who had just built a flawless trap. I instantly dropped my voice to a frantic, terrified whisper. I played the role of the helpless elderly widower hiding in the dark. I told the emergency operator that 2 armed men had just smashed through my front living room window and were currently tearing my house apart. I said they had heavy weapons and were violently trying to break down the door to my basement. The operator told me to stay perfectly still, keep the door locked, and stay on the open line. I sat back down in my comfortable leather chair, listening to her rapid typing echoing through the phone receiver. I was perfectly calm. The heavy structural load was no longer my responsibility. It only took exactly 6 minutes. In a quiet, affluent suburban neighborhood, a reported armed home invasion in progress is the highest possible priority for law enforcement. I heard the distant wail of multiple sirens cutting through the still night air. The screaming sound grew louder and more aggressive, multiplying as several police units converged rapidly on my street. Then the visual assault began. Brilliant flashes of harsh red and blue emergency lights violently illuminated my dark bedroom, cutting through the narrow gaps in the window blinds. The spinning strobes washed over the exterior walls of my house, painting the shattered glass in the living room below with frantic, pulsing colors. The entire neighborhood was abruptly awakened. I could hear heavy tires screeching to a violent halt on the pavement outside. Car doors slammed in rapid, aggressive succession. Heavy boots hit the asphalt in a synchronized rush. I stood up from my chair and carefully unhooked the heavy, solid steel barricade brackets from my bedroom door. I walked slowly down the hallway, keeping my hands raised, empty and visible. The police officers had their weapons drawn as they stepped carefully through the ruined bay window. Bright tactical flashlight beams cut through the dark, sweeping aggressively over the splintered furniture and the completely destroyed kitchen cabinets. I called out to them from the top of the stairs, letting my voice shake just enough to sound authentic. 5 heavily armed officers quickly secured the main floor and moved toward me with focused intensity. A seasoned sergeant stepped forward asking if I was injured and demanding to know if the intruders were still inside the structure. I nodded, leaning heavily against the wooden banister to project physical weakness. I pointed a trembling finger toward the dark hallway leading to the basement stairs. I told them the two men were trapped downstairs inside my old reinforced engineering workroom. The sergeant looked at the massive scale of the physical destruction in the living room and then looked back at me with absolute serious intent. He asked me exactly how I managed to trap two violent armed men inside a basement. I reached deep into the pocket of my cardigan and pulled out two items. I held out a small, heavy brass override key and a sleek silver digital storage drive. I explained to the officer that I was a retired structural engineer and that I had installed a heavy magnetic security door years ago to protect my expensive industrial tools. I told him I heard the men go inside the room, and I simply engaged the electronic magnetic lock from my bedroom control panel, trapping them inside. Then I handed him the silver digital drive. I told him he would absolutely need this for the district attorney. I explained that I had a security camera and audio system wired directly into that basement room. I took a slow, ragged breath and let a perfectly timed tear slip down my cheek. I told the officer that one of the intruders was my own son. I told him my son had brought a violent underground loan shark into my home to rob me, and that their entire full confession to multiple felonies was completely recorded on that drive. The sergeant took the items, his expression shifting rapidly from protective concern to absolute stunned shock. He looked at the drive and then immediately signaled his tactical team. They moved silently and swiftly down the basement stairs. I stood at the top of the landing and listened to the final mechanical sequence of the trap. The officers took up tactical positions around the heavy wooden door. The sergeant inserted the brass override key into the emergency release panel mounted on the concrete wall. The heavy industrial magnetic locks disengaged with a loud, heavy clack. The officers kicked the solid door open and swarmed into the small concrete room, screaming loud, overlapping commands. "Drop the weapon right now. Get on the ground. Put your hands behind your back." I heard the heavy, brutal thud of Vince being driven hard into the concrete floor. The massive, violent enforcer did not fight back. He knew he was surrounded by loaded weapons and blinding tactical lights. Then I heard Justin. He was crying, sobbing hysterically, as the officers slammed him against the cold concrete wall and violently wrenched his arms behind his back. The sharp, metallic ratcheting sound of steel handcuffs echoed loudly up the stairwell. They dragged them up the wooden stairs. Vince came first, practically carried by two large officers. His face was pushed down toward his chest, and he looked completely defeated. The predator had finally been put into a cage. Then they brought my son. Justin was a complete physical wreck. His expensive designer clothes were violently torn and covered in thick gray concrete dust. His face was swollen from crying, and his knees kept buckling under his own weight, requiring the officers to physically drag him forward through the hallway. They marched them right through the center of my ruined living room, forcing them to step over the shattered glass and the broken pieces of their own destroyed inheritance. They pushed them out the front door and down the exterior steps right into the glaring, chaotic wash of the red and blue emergency lights. I walked slowly into my living room and stood by the broken window looking out at the front lawn. The street was completely full of police cruisers. Every single house on the block had its porch lights turned on. Neighbors were standing on their manicured lawns, pulling their bathrobes tight against the cold night air, watching the spectacle unfold. They were watching the supposedly successful, wealthy young man from the neighborhood being dragged down the driveway like a common violent street thug. It was an absolute, undeniable public execution of his character and his carefully constructed fake life. There was no way to hide this. The community was witnessing the total collapse of his elaborate facade. The officers pushed Vince roughly into the back of the first squad car, slamming the door shut. Then they dragged Justin toward the second cruiser. Just before the officer pushed his head down to clear the metal doorframe, Justin stopped. He planted his feet on the asphalt and turned his head desperately. He looked back at the house. He looked right through the shattered bay window and locked his red, swollen eyes directly with mine. He was standing in this harsh, blinding glare of the police spotlights. He looked incredibly small and utterly pathetic. His eyes were begging me in the silence of the night. He was silently pleading for me to walk outside to talk to the police, to tell them it was all just a big misunderstanding. He desperately wanted me to save him one last time. He wanted the soft, forgiving father to magically reappear and make the severe legal consequences go away. I stood perfectly still in the dark shadows of my ruined living room. I did not nod. I did not shake my head. I looked at him with the absolute cold finality of an engineer walking away from a condemned building right before the demolition charges detonate. I reached out and grabbed the edge of the heavy fabric curtain hanging beside the window frame. Justin watched my hand move. He opened his mouth to scream something desperate, but I did not wait to hear it. I pulled the heavy curtain completely closed, shutting him out of my sight and out of my life forever. 6 months have passed since that violent, chaotic night. The heavy winter snows have melted away, leaving behind a bright, crisp spring. I do not live in that neighborhood anymore. I never bothered to fix the shattered bay window or rebuild the splintered oak cabinets in the kitchen. I simply packed up the few personal items that actually mattered to me, the photograph of my wife, my old engineering tools, and a few good books, and I left the structural wreckage exactly as it was. I sold the property to a commercial real estate developer for cash. They did not care about the broken glass or the ruined walls. They just wanted the land. The house where I raised my son, the house that became a violent trap, is currently being completely demolished to make way for something new. The heavy physical anchor that tied me down to that painful life has been completely severed. I worked closely with Mr. Gallagher to completely liquidate the massive bearer bonds, transferring the entire $600,000 into a secure, accessible global account in my name alone. I am no longer a man hiding a fortune in a dark basement. I am a man who is finally ready to live. The legal system moved with surprising, terrifying speed once the district attorney heard the crystal-clear audio recording from the basement. There was no complex trial. There were no expensive defense lawyers who could spin a deceptive narrative of a family misunderstanding. Justin tried to claim he was under extreme duress, but his own voice detailing the months of calculated elder abuse and financial forgery sealed his fate completely. Vince, the violent underground debt collector, realized he was trapped by the evidence and immediately took a plea deal. He turned state evidence against my son, testifying in open court about the extortion and the planned burglary in exchange for a slightly reduced sentence. Watching criminals turn on each other in a desperate bid for survival was the final pathetic chapter of their partnership. Justin was convicted of multiple severe felonies, including attempted grand larceny, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit extortion. The judge did not show an ounce of leniency to a young, wealthy man who tried to legally bury his own father. Justin was sentenced to 5 to 15 years in the state penitentiary. He traded his luxury high-rise penthouse for a tiny windowless concrete cell that is ironically very similar to the basement room where his fake life finally ended. Monica did not fare much better in the aftermath. Without Justin's illicit money and with the heavy fraud alerts permanently attached to her name, her financial world collapsed instantly. The bank formally evicted them from the penthouse just 48 hours after Justin was arrested. The dealership repossessed her luxury sport utility vehicle right out of the parking garage, leaving her standing on the sidewalk with nothing but the designer clothes on her back. She tried to reach out to her wealthy friends for a place to stay, but the moment the local news published the details of the elder abuse charges, she became a complete social pariah. Every single door in her elite circle was slammed tightly shut in her face. The people she used to drink expensive champagne with suddenly did not even know her name. Last I heard through my lawyer, she had formally filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. She is currently working long, brutal hours as a retail cashier at a discount clothing store, living in a tiny, cramped studio apartment on the bad side of town. Her designer clothes have been sold to pay for cheap groceries. The universe has a very precise way of balancing the scales. She wanted to live like a queen using stolen money, and now she is learning the true crushing weight of an honest minimum wage dollar. I am currently sitting in the quiet, luxurious first-class lounge of the international terminal at the airport. The environment is incredibly peaceful. The soft hum of the air conditioning and the quiet murmur of polite conversation are the only sounds in the room. I am wearing a sharp tailored suit that fits me perfectly. Resting on the polished glass table in front of me is a thick leather passport wallet and a first-class boarding pass to Rome, Italy. Decades ago, when Justin was just a little boy, my beautiful wife Barbara used to bring home glossy travel brochures from the agency downtown. We would sit at the kitchen table late at night, drinking cheap coffee and circling the beautiful pictures of the Amalfi Coast, the ancient Roman ruins, and the sprawling vineyards of Tuscany. We swore we would take that trip together for our 20th wedding anniversary. But when the time came, Justin needed a massive deposit for an expensive private college. So we folded up the brochures and put the dream away in a drawer. Then he needed money for a lavish wedding. Then he needed help with a down payment on a luxury car. We kept postponing our own lives, sacrificing our own joy to fund his endless, bottomless desires. Barbara died before she ever got to feel the warm breeze of the Mediterranean Sea. She sacrificed everything for a boy who grew up to be a monster. I pick up my ceramic cup and take a slow sip of the rich, dark coffee. I look out the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the heavy commercial jets slowly taxi across the tarmac. The bright morning sun reflects off the silver wings. For the first time in my entire adult life, I feel completely weightless. I do not have to worry about paying someone else's debts. I do not have to look over my shoulder in my own home. I am free. My smartphone suddenly vibrates against the smooth glass table, shattering my quiet reflection. The screen lights up, showing an incoming call from an unknown toll-free number. I calmly set my coffee cup down and swipe the screen to answer. I lift the phone to my ear. A sterile, automated robotic voice speaks through the receiver. It says I have a collect call from an inmate at the state correctional facility. The machine pauses and asks me to press the number 1 to accept the financial charges for the call. In the faint static background behind the robotic voice, I can hear Justin. He is crying. His voice sounds incredibly small, desperate, and completely broken. He is begging into the receiver, pleading for me to pick up the line, asking me to please just talk to him for 1 minute. He is likely terrified, lonely, and realizing the absolute horrific reality of his new life behind bars. I sit there, in the comfortable leather lounge chair, listening to the pathetic sound of his tears echoing through the digital connection. I do not feel angry anymore. I do not feel a sudden rush of paternal guilt. I feel absolutely nothing but a profound, deep sense of closure. The emotional cord that tied me to that boy was violently severed the night he brought a man with a weapon into my home, and I have absolutely no desire to ever reattach it. I lower the phone from my ear. I look at the glowing screen one last time. I do not yell or offer any final words of wisdom. I simply press the red decline button. The call instantly disconnects, plunging the phone back into perfect silence. I slip the device into my jacket pocket. I pick up my leather passport wallet and my boarding pass. The intercom chimes softly, announcing the final boarding call for my flight to Rome. I stand up, smooth the lapels of my jacket, and walk confidently toward the boarding gate. The silent adjustment is officially permanent. The most profound lesson this ordeal taught me is that unconditional love should never mean unconditional access to your life. For decades, I believed that quietly fixing my son's mistakes was an act of paternal devotion, but in reality, I was only funding his arrogance. We are taught from birth that family is our safest harbor, yet blood does not guarantee loyalty. It often just provides a much closer vantage point for a devastating betrayal. True strength in your later years is not about hoarding wealth. It is about having the absolute courage to recognize when the people you raised have become the predators you must defend against, because you can never save someone who is actively trying to destroy you. If you have ever had to draw a hard line to protect yourself from a toxic family member, share your story in the comments below and hit subscribe to join our community of survivors.